Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbett. It's May 25, 2017, and today we are speaking with Alice Dawkins, an ANU Honours graduate completing a long-term study program here in Myanmar, and she is also working towards publication of her honours thesis about the perception of Kuomintang temporary and permanent migration into regions of the Shan State in the 1950s, which will be the topic of our conversation today. Hello.
Hello, Luke. How are you?
Very well. Okay, let's get stuck into your honours thesis. I know that it uses a range of English, Burmese and Chinese language source materials, which is unusual for an honours thesis.
It is, and if we're being technical, there's French sources in there too, but they didn't make the final cut, so...
I missed, okay, there's French in there as well. And you use these sources to problematise the traditional state-centric or ethnocentric Burmese narrative about the Kuomintang incursion into the Kengtung area, which you term the aggression narrative. So what is this accepted history, and what, in your view, are its shortcomings?
Sure, okay. The so-called aggression narrative that I termed it, I discovered that by reading a lot of Burmese sources that Nick Cheeseman very kindly pointed me in the direction
Your
of.
supervisor, right?
He is my current supervisor. Nick Farrelly supervised this project. But Nick Cheeseman very kindly directed me towards some sources actually held at our National Library in Canberra.
Great resource.
Great resource. Shout out to the NLA. And they had voluminous sources from this time, which is quite unusual.
And a very quiet reading room as well.
Very quiet reading room. And they were fantastic. I went through 2 or 3 newspapers and isolated the time period of about 1950 to 1954 and just flipped through, and thankfully a lot of them are sort of semi-illustrated, and it was very easy to find references to KMT because there were often these very vivid cartoons accompanying any mention of the KMT forces, and some of them are in the paper that I shared with you, and they're it was quite alarming imagery, right? Like, you've got this KMT soldier who's stepping over the body of a half-naked woman, which carries all these sort of concerning themes with it, and with all of these references to KMT, there was this sort of motif of aggression, or it became translated as aggression, but it was jujomu. And it was from that lineage, I guess, where I identified the source of this word choice and this perception, which was in these Burmese language newspapers. And then that got carried through into an English language text published by the Ministry of Information, which is obviously some sort of propaganda piece. And then that collated a lot of the reports that you'd seen come through in the Burmese press. And it was from these 2 bodies of work, mostly the English language text, that subsequent scholarship had drawn a lot of their assumptions.
I see.
And I wasn't really going out to challenge the version of events. I mean, I'm by no means a KMT apologist or anything like that, but I sensed that there would be some wiggle room in how the story could be told, or maybe retold. And that's why I started looking around for Chinese sources just to put in conversation with the Burmese view. And again, it was in Canberra that I found a copy of this travel journal, which is called a Youji. And this is a Chinese language travel journal. The original edition, it's in the Menzies Library at the ANU, which is quite remarkable. I can't imagine there were many copies of this published. And I found it completely by accident. I knew about the author. I was actually looking for another book he'd written that was more of an official history of the KMT remnants. But just as the wonderful thing about library stacks is that you come across things you don't expect. And I found this book that actually hadn't been listed in the literature reviews on the KMT in Burma. And it turned out to be an absolute thesis goldmine because it is a travel diary written by a Chinese scholar He was actually trained in law, had studied in Paris, spoke French, saw himself as a political commentator and writer. He had a lot of talent, put it that way. And this book was kind of a work of literature, I think he would have seen it as. And that was how I got to this point of testing, I suppose, or tweaking this quite unilateral conception of the KMT or the white Chinese as aggressors in Shan State.
Wonderful. It's a very good linear explanation of how you came to do it as well. Thank you. So, I mean, including myself, I'm sure some of the listeners are trying to picture this part of Shan State in the 1950s. Could you talk more about Kengtung and that area during the time of your research? Like who lived there and why? And were they recent migrants or had they lived there for generations? And also maybe touch on political structure and systems. You go into this quite a bit in your paper. You mentioned that Kengtung was a meeting point of sovereign, sojourner, and settler systems. What were these and what was replacing them at this time of great change?
Yeah, sure. So I was guided by this idea that 1950 was, to paraphrase a famous book in China studies, a year of great significance in the region, and a year of great significance for both the futures of China and of Burma. And as you've alluded, it was a time when things were very much up for contestation. Various politics and political identities were blurred and they were multifaceted. And it was also a time when I think I said something in the thesis of these two sort of simultaneously flowing cogs of empire. You had the Suoguo administration, or the Suoguo system, which are the
Shan princes.
The Shan princes, yes, which were clearly in decline. Or maybe not clearly. With the benefit of hindsight, we say clearly. That sort of system of rapidly becoming yesteryear was in decline. And then there were the KMT, who was sort of the imperial equivalents in a way from across the border. They were, whether they knew it or not, their system was sort of slowly tuning down for a very different phase of history. And I guess what intrigued me about 1950 is the flashpoint to view this all from is that this epic change that was facing Kengtung, that was facing the entire region, was by no means clear in that moment. And you can deduce this from Ding's writings when you read his travel journal, because he is writing a great hope. I mean, maybe it was misplaced, but a great hope that the KMT were going to reassemble and return to China, to mainland China, and to have another crack at, restoring their system. And that was something that I found fascinating and indeed quite sad. And so I guess where the three systems come in, I read the journal quite closely, which has so much material in it, far more than what I could actually pull into a 25,000 word thesis. But I was looking at how Ding was writing about his surrounding environment, which was mostly Kengtung, which was the largest of the Shan states. Kengtung, of course, we think of now as just the town, right? But it was actually quite a large area extending beyond current-day Kengtung city limits. And the categories that were jumping out at me, and I sort of arranged myself, were those three groups. Sovereign, as in the Shan princes, settlers as these Chinese long-stayers, the long-term migrants who came across from Yunnan or Guangzhou and then made a new life in Kengtung area. And then there were these sojourning merchants who were coming back and forth as things progressed throughout the year, hurrying back when rainy season came and this kind of thing. And emerged that there were all these sort of forces at play, right? Like if you can think of the sovereign group, they had this sort of expanding, contracting, like circular influence that was diminishing day by day, according to Ding in the diary. You had these sojourners who were constituting this two-way traffic on the trade routes. And then you had these sort of settlers who, with this big movement, it wasn't really a big movement, how to say this. The settlers were this pull coming over from southwestern China who were making a new life for themselves in Kengtung, many of which were perhaps politically aligned with KMT, at least the ones that Ding spoke to. And so Ding doesn't go out and say, there's these three systems. That was very much my own interpretation. But I wanted to use his observations arranged like this to suggest that Kengtung was a pretty complicated place in 1950. There were long stayers, there were short stayers, and there were kind of people in between who were moving from place to place. And it was by no means as simple as this place where then Burma exercised absolute sovereignty. And that's something that Ding actually challenges, but in a very complicated way, drawing upon the international law of the time. But he has a long section in the book where he talks about this issue of legal sovereignty, which is a little dry to go through now, but he had his own views about, according to standards of international law, the Union government, in fact, did not exercise actual control over Kengtung.
Can you talk a bit more about him, I guess, and about this book? I understand he had quite a time. He was imprisoned. He ended up going back to Taiwan, right? And that's where he did the writing up of this stuff.
I'm not clear if he wrote this up in Rangoon or if he wrote it up in Taipei.
Okay, he also went to Yangon, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I came to be really fond of Ding, I think because he was my daily friend in honours, I kind of
It's good to have dead friends. they can't talk back to you, right?
I sort of read his book over a very long winter in Australia.
Okay, even better.
And I did become quite fond of the guy, and there's pictures that hopefully we can put on the podcast to show just the life that was in this guy's eyes. So as I alluded to, Ding was educated in Paris. He studied law, and he also considered himself a political commentator and probably a writer of great literature as well. And something I found quite fascinating about him was that in a similar tone to Leach, he kind of considers himself a bit of an anthropologist and, an interpreter of what is going on around him. The tradition of the Yoji is quite interesting when you look at Chinese literature, because that was a very specific genre of writing that kind of court elites would pen when they traveled to the distant frontiers. And the Yoji kind of dictated a particular mood and a particular choice of language, which Ding doesn't always adhere to, right? Like, he is unusually hopeful and optimistic, and quite often sort of gilds the lily in how he writes about these places. And the mood of his book is, I think, while he doesn't shy away from admitting the quite disastrous things that faced both himself and the forces, he is unusually colourful and excited about where he is. And you look at pictures of him, he's got this huge grin on his face. He's this sort of tiny guy, like, in all of the group photos, he's demonstrably smaller than everyone else. And I just got the sense that he was this kind of adventurer who, even though he was considerably later in life by the time of the KMT movement into Burma, he was still full of interest and engagement with this new part of the world he was experiencing, and what seemed to me an enduring sense of hope that the KMT were perhaps going to restore their system.
And he was contemporaneous with Leach as well.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Like, you wonder what had happened if you had those two guys having tea together in a room.
If they ever met.
There's other things about Ding that I found interesting. Ding pops up in a few English language works on sort of Southeast Asian history. He was very much the broker for the KMT. He came over with the forces, and he was sent off to negotiate alliances. And it was mostly because of Ting, I believe, that the KMT forged so many interesting networks throughout the region. And they were interested in him because he spoke French, and the original plan for the forces was actually to go to Indochina. Burma was sort of the plan B or the plan C, if you will. And you may know that some of the KMT did attempt to go to Indochina, so separate forces to the ones who made it to Kengtung, but they were pretty swiftly stopped and disarmed. And so Ding had pretty substantial networks in Indochina, but obviously had to work with a pretty new, changed environment. And there's passages of the Yoji where you listen to him recount his efforts networking with anyone and everyone who he found. I mean, he's talking to the caravan bosses, he's talking to the Sino-Chinese businessmen, he's talking to the village women who are washing their clothes in the river.
Wow.
Everything is sort of an opportunity for him to sort of send the KMT message and fly the flag, I think, because he was also, there's no sort of sugarcoating it, he was a devout patriot.
Ideologue.
And an ideologue, no doubt, and it's something that I sort of struggled with finding the right words for when I was writing about him, because there's a line in a book somewhere which says he was in charge of the ideological education for the KMT so-called university in Shan State. And I sort of struggled to use that word to describe him, as an ideologue, because we, especially in today's really politically charged climate, when we say ideologue, we think that that's somehow absent from critical thought and from higher level thinking, where here was a guy who was a really quite a profound intellectual and scholar who sort of turns up in this funny part of history and this funny part of the world where you really don't expect to see him. And he was certainly a long way from his law degree in Paris, right? His book provided this really unique chance to have a primary source detailing a KMT elite's sense of what was happening to them at this crucial juncture in 1950. And that was something I really wanted to bring into conversation with these other histories and with these other sources, because 1950, we all forget, was a time of immense uncertainty. China could have gone either way. Indeed, Burma could have gone a multitude of ways in 1950. And as I suggest, by mapping out these at least three different political and, if you will, social systems, within someone's own life, things were up for contestation and up for adaptation. And I use these examples that Ting talks about with how across even one generation of a family, you could have a Yunnan family come over into Kengtung, or perhaps a Yunnan single merchant, and he marries a local woman and they have kids, he learns the language, maybe he even adopts Buddhism, and then he becomes a local leader. And that's all in his one life. He undergoes what some would call an ethnogenesis, right? And so in a way, Ting's doing a bit of kind of low-grade anthropology there. And I found those observations he makes about the lineages of Chinese migration in Shan State quite compelling, and possibly even foreshadowing a future for the KMT, although he himself would not have been cognizant at that time that was what their fate might become.
Yeah. I mean, certainly these voices are completely absent from most Burma scholarship or teaching of history, and most of the scholarship as well by foreigners writing about this.
And it's awkward in a way. It's an awkward
Absolutely.
story about an awkward time.
Yep. Like you can see why Burma people don't want. Why would they include that voice? So
I think why this story of the KMT so-called remnants in Burma is such a valid area for historical inquiry is their marginality, both geographically and then in the historical record. This is still so fraught. I mean, I wrote a short op-ed about this about a year ago when I was developing the thesis, and I guess I just wanted to test the water and see how my ideas were received. And I wrote a piece for The Diplomat, and I was very politely but quite significantly shredded by a few people online. And for, reasons that you can probably understand and reasons that I understand. And so that's why when I was developing this to a final thesis, and indeed as I developed this for publication, I'm not trying to present a counter-narrative, so to speak. I'm just trying to play around with what we have already in the historical record and introduce this quite extraordinary person's life and book into that. And I think Ting himself is, when we study Borderlands, right, like Borderlands history is coming through as a very trendy thing to do right now. Or I've just recently heard about how entangled history is.
Entanglements.
Particularly key theme in how we're trying to understand regions and how we're trying to understand Asia. Ting is perhaps the perfect example of historical figures of that time who were multilingual, who came from these particular political processes and had these particular ambitions and particular lives. So with the KMT and Kengtung, I did want to take a look backwards into history rather than forwards into the modern era, as most of the scholarly treatments of them was done. And it was inspired by something in Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed, where he looks at this motif of migratory flows of Chinese exiles. It's something that I think runs throughout the entire book, but is relatively in the background. There's a lot of other quite big theory that he's developing throughout that text, but there's this idea of sort of exile flows of, as he calls it, defeated dynasties of the Chinese state in whatever form it took. And there was something quite interesting that happens in The Art of Not Being Governed, where you might recall that Scott chooses a year as the cutoff date for when his theory sort of expires, if you will. And it was to, I guess, protect against quite aggressive challenges to the theory.
I recall it just being roughly World War II.
No, actually, it's about 1950.
1950?
Yeah. And, of course, the about added there suggests that that's up for interpretation. But the fact that he chose the year that does turn out to be the year that the KMT entered Burma, it did get me thinking a little more about the extraordinariness of this time period. And looking at that with an awareness of this motion that had been happening over many generations. Indeed, basically at the end of every Chinese dynasty, there had been a move towards the southwest from the defeated Chinese state. And it was something I began to realize that perhaps we weren't treating the KMT as one of these defeated dynasties in the same ways that we treat, say, the defeated Ming. As many scholars of Southeast Asia know, the Ming Emperor fled towards Burma, as it then was, as that dynasty was defeated, and the remnants of that dynasty came towards Burma and indeed entered Burma for refuge and for attempted preparations for reprisal. And it's something I would really like to develop with this history of the KMT, that perhaps we can fit them into this lineage of a generational, consistent southwestern flow of not only defeated emperors, but their sympathizers and their loyal soldiers as well.
And I love that throughout the entire 25,000 words, you never refer to this as the democratic period.
Yes.
I mean, that's what most of the narratives say. That's why people write about 1950s drama.
Right, and I think that's why the story could be quite interesting to share with a wider audience, because it does give you a very different take on what was happening on the so-called periphery. Kengtung, of course, was, we could argue from reading these sources, far from being a periphery, in fact, a sort of centrifugal artery of economic activity and indeed political activity and political contestation.
And it still is.
Yeah, it still is. And I think that's why looking to 1950 is this year of great significance. The more I read on sort of modern Myanmar politics, the more I'm convinced that we really need to go back and, with the benefit of several decades hindsight, revisit these critical junctures and these critical years in history and maybe try and look backwards, and indeed backwards quite a long way, to really make sense of the movements of people and the traditions that had been taking place in these kind of towns.
So we're about out of time. I always ask guests on Myanmar Musings to give a recommendation to the audience. It can be related to what we've spoken about, or it can be about something completely different. Do you have anything?
Yeah, so my favourite book on Asian studies at the moment is an edited volume called Asia Inside Out. It's edited by Helen Liu, Peter Perdue, and Eric Tagliacozzo.
Uh-huh.
And they develop sort of conceptual threads and ideas from which I took a lot of inspiration with this thesis. And they're looking at things like, both temporal themes and spatial themes. So they look at connected places, and they also look at these ideas of sort of critical years in Asian history. And it's an area of scholarship that I am really excited by. And as we were discussing in the context of why Kengtung at 1950 is so important for Myanmar, this kind of work bears pretty ripe fruit for current political quandaries and questions throughout Asia.
All right, that's it. I have a feeling that you're going to translate this travel journal into English down the line. So that's fantastic.
Reading my mind.
You've got an entire life's work of scholarship all laid out for you.
Ready to go.
And I got you when you were still early career. So thank you for being on Myanmar Musings and recording this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.